To a Western audience, Custom Robo is a series that began back on the GameCube with the 2004 release of a game known simply as Custom Robo. However, in Japan, that same game comes with the subtitle Battle Revolution, making the original title of this game Custom Robo Battle Revolution. The reason for this distinction is that in Japan, the Custom Robo series did not begin in 2004 on the GameCube, but instead way back in 1999 on the Nintendo 64. The name of this Japan-only game is also just simply Custom Robo, which does make things a bit confusing when talking about the series as a whole. However, today we are just going to be talking about the N64 version of Custom Robo, so that shouldn't be too much of an issue. Custom Robo was developed by a company known as Noise Inc., whose developmental portfolio to date is made up almost entirely of Custom Robo titles. In case you're unfamiliar with the games, Custom Robo is a series of mostly story-driven action RPGs where you battle opponents with a toy-like robot that you can customize with various different parts like guns and bombs, hence the name Custom Robo. As I mentioned, the game we're going to be talking about here today is the first iteration of this long-running formula. So without further ado, let's get into the review of Custom Robo for the Nintendo 64. To start off, let's, as we always do, talk about what we see when we start up the game for the very first time. And when it comes to Custom Robo, there's not too much to talk about here. We are first greeted with the two logos for the Nintendo 64 and Noise Inc., and these are just bare-bones logos on a white background that really don't do anything for me at all. If you've seen some of my other reviews, you'll probably know I'm a pretty big fan of unique and interesting logo introductions. The reason for this is that in many cases, these company logos are the very first things you'll see when starting up a game, which means they're literally the first impression your game makes. There's a reason the classic Pixar logo screen is so iconic and well remembered. And in my opinion, that's because it was super unique and fun to watch. It built up your expectations for what was to come and had you enjoying the movie from the very first thing you saw. Now, I'm not saying that every game company has to make a super elaborate logo intro for their games, but just a little bit of creativity here would go a long way. I mean, look at Rare, for example, a company that was at their peak around the same time that Custom Robo came out. Their logo intros on the N64 were all super well done, from the simple spinning logos of Diddy Kong Racing to the more Pixar-esque logo intro of Banjo-Kazooie. Rare always had you hooked from the first second you started up one of their games. Custom Robo, on the other hand, left a lot to be desired. Now, one thing I will say is that the intro to the title screen was much better. A bunch of katakana characters come flying in to spell out custom, which is then followed by a custom robo in dice form rolling onto the screen and turning over to reveal the word robo. It's great. There's a lot of motion, it brings the main attraction of the N64, the 3D, into the spotlight from the get-go, and the sound effects are a lot of fun. The sad thing though is that the title screen this excellent intro leads to is pretty much entirely static. All we needed was a simple 3D model of the main Custom Robo Ray walking around or striking some poses, and that would have made this 1,000 times better. Just anything to catch the player's eye and make them think, oh, that's cool, or that's funny, would keep the fun levels high until the actual game starts. And speaking of the actual game, let's move on to our discussion of the intro to Scenario Mode, this game's story mode. The story begins with the main character, aka us, waking up in our room from a dream about Custom Robo. We violently roll out of bed, presumably from the pure intensity of the battle we were just witnessing, and our mom comes in to check on us. She reminds us that today is a special day and says to come downstairs. We quickly get changed into our sick backwards visor and matching Marty McFly outfit and head on down to the living room where our parents are awaiting us. Our mom presents us with an odd-looking cube with various symbols on each side. This turns out to be the Custom Robo Ray that our parents got us as a present. Our dad remarks that we may not know how to use such a strange contraption, to which our mom replies that we're going to learn everything we need to know about Custom Robo from our cousin, Shinichi, who's on his way over. Immediately following this, Shinichi arrives and helps us register as the owner of our Robo. He then says the rest should be learned through actual battles and proceeds to lead us to the Custom Robo station in town. This is where the player gains control of the main character and gameplay finally begins. We talk to some NPCs who give us some tips about battling and Custom Robo in general, and then head upstairs to go a few practice rounds against Shinichi and some other commanders as they're called in Custom Robo. After a few battles, Shinichi leads us to the park, another relatively major location in Custom Robo, where we meet and then quickly defeat Karin, another of the main group of friends that make up the main cast of the game. Following this, Shinichi says it's getting late, so we return home and go to bed, ending our first day as a Custom Robo commander, which also ends what I would consider to be the intro to the game. And as far as intros go, this is a decently good one in my opinion. It's carefree and fun and does a good job of setting up some of our main characters as well as the adventure to come. Sure, it's pretty much exactly the same as every Pokemon game intro, but that's fine. Pokemon intros are jaunty and to the point. They do a good job of explaining things in a way that makes sense to the main audience of children without boring the many adults who also play. And the same can be said for Custom Robo. Now, before we start discussing scenario mode as a whole, I think it would be a good idea to explain to you guys how the battle system in Custom Robo works and give you my opinion on that so you'll have a good basis for how the game actually functions. So, first things first, before every battle starts, you'll have the ability to customize your Custom Robo to best suit the battle ahead. You have access to all the information about your opponent's Custom Robo, which makes strategizing before the battle pretty straightforward, which I like. Many other RPGs like Pokemon and Dragon Quest don't allow you to see much of anything about your opponent before a battle starts, which means you either have to come up with the best strategy possible with the little information you have prior to engaging, or just move things around on the fly in the midst of battle. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't think every RPG should let you know everything about your opponent before a battle because some games are just better with minimal knowledge. However, for other RPGs like Custom Robo that have a more robust battle system, where counterpicking your opponent can sometimes feel like the only way to win, having the ability to take a peek at what your opponent is working with prior to a battle is pretty key. As for what commanders actually do have to work with in terms of customization, there's the gun found on your robot's right arm, the bomb on your robot's left arm, the pods on your robot's back, and the legs, which are pretty self-explanatory. Each of these individual parts come in a multitude of different variations, making for an enormous amount of possible combinations. Now, when you first start playing, it might seem like the combination you choose doesn't really matter, but as you make your way through scenario mode, you'll quickly realize that being able to effectively make combos in battle with your bombs, guns, and pods can be a pretty big factor in making hard battles much easier. As for how battles actually work, well, the overarching goal is relatively simple. Just get your opponent to 0 health before you reach 0 health. It's the same tried and true battle formula used in basically every RPG. However, Custom Robo battles take place in 3D and in real time, which makes things much more active than your typical RPG. There's a lot to keep track of while you're constantly moving and under fire from your opponent, so having a very simple goal is nice. Another element of Custom Robo battles that keeps you on your toes is how the battle actually starts. Both Custom Robos will be in dice form in the arm cannons of a big robot that will shoot your dice out after a quick countdown. You have free control of the angle at which your dice gets shot out, which adds another level of strategy to the game. Sometimes you want to land close to your opponent, and sometimes you want to land far away. Sometimes you want to be behind cover, and sometimes you want to be right in the middle of the arena. It's up to you how you want to start the battle, which is a really cool take on arena battle gameplay in my opinion. Another thing to be mindful of when choosing where to land your dice, though, is that the side your dice lands on will determine how fast you're able to get up after your robo transforms into its humanoid form. Each side of the dice is labeled with an icon that corresponds to a side of your Custom Robo, with the fastest and therefore best side being the face, which will have you standing upright when your robot transforms, letting you get right into the battle. The worst side to land on is the feet, which will leave you upside down and struggling to get up for quite a while. In all honesty, this can be a pretty frustrating system sometimes, as tends to be the case with most luck-based systems. Sometimes you'll have the perfect opener methodically planned out to give you the upper hand, and it'll all be ruined because you rolled a feet and your opponent rolled a face. Times like those definitely suck, but luckily the start of each battle isn't super important in terms of overall victory thanks to the downing system. The way this system works is that when you do a certain amount of damage to your opponent, they will be knocked down, allowing you to get some free damage in for a short period of time, followed by your opponent becoming invulnerable for a few seconds. The amount of damage needed to down an enemy and the amount of time they'll stay downed is based on which Custom Robo you're fighting. It's essentially a battle equalizer that occurs every few seconds or so on average. Since the opponent will be invulnerable when they wake up, it's in your best interest to disengage after getting a few shots in, effectively bringing the battle back to even footing. It's actually a really smart way to keep things from swinging radically in one side's favor. Without the downing system, games would just be a combo fest where being hit even once could mean defeat, like in Marvel vs. Capcom or something. But other than these few systems, you just keep using your weapons to damage your opponent until you win, and that's how battles work in Custom Robo. Overall, battles are really fun in my opinion, which is good because they're the main element of actual gameplay in Custom Robo. If the battles weren't fun, the game wouldn't have a solid foundation to build itself around, and would ultimately end up much more boring as a result. Thankfully though, that's not the case here. But anyway, now that we've got an understanding of the battle system, we can move on to talking about scenario mode as a whole. If I was to describe the story of Custom Robo in the simplest way possible, I'd say it's just like your typical Sunday morning shonen anime. The story starts out with the main character being a complete beginner in the world of Custom Robo, but before you know it, they're taking on and defeating opponents who have been practicing for years. We form a tight-knit group of friends that includes a nerdy boy with very large glasses, a tomboyish girl with big dreams, a sickly girl whose older brother is the current Custom Robo champion, a goofy oaf of a kid who one-sidedly claims us as his rival, and our actual rival who starts out mean, but gradually comes around to our side. I'm willing to bet at least some of these descriptions rang a bell with those of you that have seen shows like Beyblade, Pokemon, Metabots, or Yu-Gi-Oh! The story mostly revolves around this group of friends among other rival commanders we meet along the way, competing in various Custom Robo tournaments. They start out small, taking place at the local Custom Robo station, but quickly increase in scale to the point where we're battling in large arenas. Once again, this is all very shonen anime-esque. There's even an evil organization of bad commanders who use illegal parts to soup up their Custom Robo with the ultimate goal of world domination. Or at least that's what I think they were trying to do. The game's not super clear on their overall plan. But I guess at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter because their plan was so bad it was easily thwarted by a group of elementary school students. Just think of them as Team Rocket or the Rare Hunters from Yu-Gi-Oh! They're comically evil villains whose only role is to spice up the somewhat bland story of Custom Robo. Now, personally, even though I'm well aware that the story of Custom Robo is just an extremely generic shonen anime story, there's no way that I could possibly ever dislike it. I have way too much nostalgia for stories like this built up in my mind over years and years of watching weekend anime as a kid, so to someone like me, this story was great. If you don't have a similar nostalgia for this type of stuff, however, you probably won't have nearly as much fun as I did with the story mode alone. Just a quick note about the length of scenario mode. It took me about 10 hours to get through, but the bulk of that time was spent talking to NPCs. A big part of how you get information about things like the battle system, your opponent's strategies, and the setting of the game is through conversation with NPCs found in pretty much every area of the game. Personally, I talked to every single NPC I saw, and that playstyle definitely came with its own positives and negatives. As far as positives go, like I said, NPCs give you a lot of extra information you wouldn't normally have, but in addition to this, there's a lot of humor and charm to be found in these conversations as well. For example, one of my favorite NPCs is this random girl who is at almost every Custom Robo event, and every time you run into her, she's eating something new and just absolutely loving it. She definitely gave me a good chuckle every time I ran into her, but if you ignored all the NPCs as you played through the story, you'd have no idea stuff like this even existed, which is a bit of a shame in my opinion, because there's so much fun stuff like this all over the place. The downside of this playstyle, however, is the sheer amount of time it takes to talk to every NPC. There's not a doubt in my mind that I spent well over double the amount of time I battled other commanders in scenario mode just talking with NPCs. The good thing though is none of these conversations are mandatory, so you can speak to NPCs as much or as little as you like. I'm honestly not sure of the best place to mention this, so I'll just throw it in here, but something I really didn't like about the scenario mode was that you can't use any other Custom Robo besides Ray, the one your mom gives you. Each main character has their own special Custom Robo that they use, and they all have different stats, so it would stand to reason that you would gain the ability to use these Custom Robo by defeating the commanders that use them, just like how you get the parts a commander was using when you beat them. I'm not gonna lie, this was probably the most disappointing thing about the game as a whole in my opinion. I know they fixed this in later games and that's nice and all, but I would have really liked to see that feature in this game as well. It's not like there's a technical reason for this decision because you can use any Custom Robo you want in arcade mode, so why not include it in scenario mode as well? Definitely a huge missed opportunity in my opinion. But anyway, since I just brought up arcade mode, let's change gears and talk about my feelings on that game mode. First of all, even though it's called arcade mode, this mode is actually a combination of several other modes, namely stage clear mode, free battle mode, and versus battle mode. Free battle mode is just your classic practice mode where you can mess around and come up with combos, and versus battle mode is exactly what it sounds like. The only real interesting mode here is stage clear mode, which has you fight your way through 10 battles on one of 5 difficulty settings of your choice. The amount of time left gets combined with your remaining health after each battle to give you a score for that round, and all 10 of your round scores then get totaled up at the end of all the battles to give you your total score. So to put it simply, this is a high score mode. I cleared all the difficulties at least once, and I can say with a pretty high level of confidence that completing this mode doesn't earn you anything in the way of extra parts or Custom Robo models, so it's not really all that satisfying to play. Most of the enemies you face are those from the story mode anyway, so there's not really much new challenge here either. The only somewhat worthwhile difficulty is Legend difficulty because it's actually somewhat challenging and does an okay job at mixing up the loadouts your opponents use. Other than that though, this mode definitely feels like a bit of an afterthought on the part of the developers. Don't get me wrong, it's nice to have something to do after completing scenario mode, but this mode just wasn't to the level of depth that I was hoping for. Next up, let's discuss the visuals of Custom Robo. So as you probably already noticed, Custom Robo uses a combination of 2D style graphics for things like the characters and NPCs, and full 3D graphics for other stuff like the backgrounds and of course the Custom Robo. So essentially what we have here is an extremely early example of an HD 2D style game. You guys may already know, but I personally love HD 2D, so this was a very welcomed surprise. The Nintendo 64 and other consoles of the same generation were built on the idea that these were 3D capable systems, and the games for these systems would mostly move over to 3D visuals to take advantage of the hype that came with 3D games at the time. So, to see a game that was brave enough to try and keep alive the 2D pixelated style of previous generations, at least to some degree, is really cool in my opinion. I've always been of the mind that certain games and genres just work better in 2D, like RPGs for example. Sure, there are a lot of great 3D RPGs out there, but I'll always be partial to 2D when it comes to my RPGs. Now, when it comes to how the visuals actually look in Custom Robo, well, in my opinion, they look great. And just as with any good HD 2D game, the juxtaposition of the 2D sprites against the low-poly 3D backgrounds is very nostalgic and visually appealing. The only difference here, though, is that these 3D visuals are not low-poly on purpose, presumably. I also really like the designs of the characters, both in the sprite form and portrait form. The portraits specifically have a number of different expressions for each character to help accentuate the conversation being had at any given time. Similar to this is the expressiveness of the sprites in Custom Robo. There's a bunch of different poses that characters will take in the story mode, and most of them are very well acted out by the 2D sprites. One thing I did not like about the visuals though was the general uniformity of all the areas. I mean, I get that this is supposed to take place in a big city like Tokyo, but did every single event in the game really have to be held inside of a gray building? Even Tokyo has rivers and wooded areas, so there's no real excuse here in my opinion. A major part of the game is also the passing of time, evidenced by each outing ending with you going home and sleeping in your bed for the night. They easily could have worked in the changing of the seasons as you played the game, which could have been a really cool way to differentiate the visuals, even in a concrete jungle like Tokyo. But overall, I'd say the visuals were a solid positive for Custom Robo. Finally, we come to our last discussion point when it comes to Custom Robo, and that is of course the music and audio. The music here is all very catchy and very late 90s RPG. If I had to describe the style, I'd say it's like a mix of the bouncy and RPG-centric nature of Pokemon music with the pure 90s synth goodness of something like Snowboard Kids. It may seem like a rather weird combination of games, but trust me, it definitely makes for some great tracks. In terms of variety, we have over 40 unique songs in Custom Robo by my count, which definitely helps to keep things fresh as you play through the game. You've got slow ballads for those nice heart-to-heart moments, upbeat, catchy tunes for everyday conversations, and of course, grandiose yet fun tournament overtures. There really is an excellent selection here. Now, in terms of the sound effects, they're all pretty wacky to the point where I'm pretty sure I've heard a few of these in Scooby-Doo. At first, the zany nature of these sound effects felt out of place to me, but they slowly grew on me as I got more acquainted with the overall fun tone of Custom Robo. I wouldn't say they were a standout part of the game or anything like that, but I did grow to like them. Custom Robo for the Nintendo 64 is a game that was never given a chance over here in the West, which was a huge missed opportunity in my opinion. I'm sure there were many Western kids back in the heyday of the Nintendo 64 that would have absolutely loved to play this game. I mean, heck, I'm an adult sitting here right now in 2022 and I had a blast with it. There's the nostalgic shonen anime style story, the many interesting and unique customization options for your Custom Robo, as well as the robust and just straight up fun battle system. Now, of course, there are negatives here too, like the samey environments, the afterthought of an arcade mode, and the inability to change Custom Robo models in scenario mode, but I don't think these are big enough issues to stop someone from having fun with this game. In my opinion, if Custom Robo was given a shot over here in the West back in the 90s or early 2000s, it would have been a hit, but I guess we'll never know for sure now, will we? If you're interested in playing Custom Robo yourself, there are a few options available to you. You could play it on the Japanese version of the Nintendo Switch Online service like I did if you know Japanese, or if you just don't care about the story. There's also of course the original cartridge release, which is surely available on eBay, but if you want a completely English localized experience, as I'm sure many of you would prefer, the 7 Seas await you yet again, sailor. But anyway, that's all I've got to say for this review. I hope you guys enjoyed the ride. If you did happen to enjoy today's video, consider giving it a like. It's always greatly appreciated and helps me out a ton. And if you want to see more content like this in the future, consider subscribing as well. Thanks as always for watching, everybody, and I'll see you in the next one. Ack out.